Imagine a closed coffin, not for a few decades but for centuries, a body embalmed in silence, waiting for something even empires cannot stop. A promise. In the heart of Egypt, where pyramids rise like fingers pointing to the sky, rested the man who once ruled alongside the pharaohs, but who never called that place home. Joseph died honored, but he made an odd request, that his bones not remain there. Why? What kind of faith asks to be carried across the desert generations after death? That's where this story begins to pulse. Joseph was never ordinary. From a young age, he carried in his eyes something that frightened even his own brothers: vision. He wasn't just the boy with extravagant dreams, he was the boy who saw too far. A kid who spoke of stars bowing, of sheaves of grain in reverence, as if he knew, without fully knowing, that his life wouldn't be lived by common rules. That irritated, that stung, and in the heart of a family marked by jealousy and favoritism, it also made him a target. Selling him was, for his brothers, a relief. For Joseph, it was the start of a silence that would shape everything to come. Taken to Egypt, treated as merchandise, thrown into a culture he didn't understand, Joseph could have been lost. He could have stopped believing, remembering, hoping, but he didn't. Something inside him refused to forget who he was and where he came from. Not even injustice broke him. When he was falsely accused and thrown into prison, he didn't give in to bitterness. When he was forgotten by those who promised to help him, he didn't lose faith. Joseph didn't know when or how, but he knew God was still there. And perhaps that's one of the most sublime parts of the story, the faith of someone who keeps believing even when buried alive in a system that swallows them whole. It was that same Joseph, silent, loyal, and steadfast, who one day rose from the depths of prison to the height of the throne. Interpreting the Pharaoh's dreams, he became the most powerful man in Egypt after the king himself. He managed the famine crisis, saved nations, rebuilt bridges with his brothers, and reunited his family. But even surrounded by power, luxury, and prestige, Joseph never forgot one thing: he didn't belong to Egypt. That in itself is already a miracle. Most people, after all Joseph endured, would have simply built a new identity there. They would have said, "This is where I was exalted. This is where I triumphed. This is my story." But not Joseph. Deep down, he still belonged to the land promised to his fathers. And that's why, at the end of his life, he made a request that to any Egyptian would be incomprehensible. "When God visits you, because he will visit, take my bones from here." It wasn't just a will, some random posthumous wish. It was an outrageous declaration of faith. Joseph knew he would die in Egypt, but he didn't want to remain in Egypt. His body would be embalmed, like the great ones of the land, but his soul still belonged to something infinitely greater than palaces and pyramids. It belonged to a promise. At that time, dying with honor in Egypt was the pinnacle. Being mummified, placed in a sarcophagus, was a privilege reserved for kings and high officials. And Joseph, as governor of Egypt, had that right. His body was prepared with care, respected, stored, but still motionless, incomplete. Because though Joseph had conquered everything, he knew the story wasn't over yet. Perhaps in that silent detail, in that body waiting in a sarcophagus, lies one of the Bible's greatest lessons. Sometimes, even when everything seems to have ended well, the believing heart still waits, still looks beyond, still refuses to call the end what God has not yet fulfilled. Joseph's request spanned generations. The Israelites lived, prospered, grew. The land that welcomed them also became the land that oppressed them. A new Pharaoh arose, one who didn't know Joseph, and the people who were once honored became enslaved. Chains, whips, humiliations. It was as if the memory of all Joseph had done had been erased, as if faith had been smothered by the weight of sand and stone walls, but not his bones. Joseph's bones remained, silent, steadfast, holding a secret. A quiet reminder that this people didn't belong to that place. Each generation born and dying in servitude might have passed by that sarcophagus and wondered, why is he still here? And perhaps, amid despair, that question rekindled hope. Because Joseph's bones weren't there for nothing. They were waiting for God's time. When Moses emerged and the Exodus began, that generation no longer remembered the days of glory. But Joseph remembered. Even dead, he remembered. Because before he died, he had said, God will surely visit you. And here the story takes a powerful turn. Amid miracles, plagues, deliverance, and desert, the Israelites didn't forget Joseph's bones. In the rush, the fear, the crossing of the Red Sea, someone, perhaps a descendant who never knew him, carried an ark. Not with gold, not with relics, but with bones. Dry bones, but full of promise. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was the exact fulfillment of what Joseph had said. It was as if God were saying, my word does not fail, not even in death. Joseph's body was buried only generations later in Shechem, in the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What seemed like a mere funeral instruction revealed itself as a prophetic key. Joseph's bones were the invisible thread stitching the end of Genesis to the beginning of Exodus, the end of an era and the start of another, the transition from patriarchy to redemption. And now, when we look at this story with keener eyes, we realize Joseph didn't ask to be taken from Egypt out of nostalgia, but out of faith. He knew the God of his fathers wouldn't abandon the people, and he wanted his body to be where the promise was fulfilled. Even if it took centuries, Joseph died at 110 years old. To us, that might seem just a high number, a historical curiosity. But to the Egyptians of that time, that number carried deep spiritual meaning. Living to 110, according to archaeological records, was a symbol of a complete, perfect life, blessed by the gods. It was the height of longevity, the seal of fullness. So even in his death, Joseph was honored, not just for his deeds, but because the span of his existence spoke to the culture of the land where he lived, while pointing to something greater. But there's an even more intriguing detail. Joseph was embalmed. This practice for the Egyptians wasn't just any ritual. Mummification was a refined art, steeped in religious beliefs, carefully performed only for the great. Preserving the body was essential because in Egyptian belief it was needed in the afterlife. The body had to be whole, pure, well preserved. It was the temple of the soul, the vessel of eternity, and Joseph, a foreigner, was treated as one of their own. That tells us much about the place he held and the impact his life had. It wasn't just his administrative feats that elevated him, but his character, his integrity, his wisdom, his fidelity to a God the Egyptians didn't know, but somehow recognized in him. Joseph didn't just adapt to the land of Egypt, he served it with excellence. And yet he remained true to his origins, to his God, to his people. His body was placed in a sarcophagus, closed, sealed, and there it stayed. Years, decades, centuries. Meanwhile, time passed. Joseph's generation vanished. His brothers died, his sons grew old, and memory began to fade like dust in the wind, until a new king arose over Egypt, one who didn't know Joseph. One who didn't know of the days when a Hebrew had saved the nation. To him, Jacob's descendants were just a strange people, too numerous, too strong, too dangerous. And so began the cycle of oppression. What was once honor turned to humiliation. What was once freedom turned to servitude. The Israelites, who once walked with heads held high, now labored under the weight of bricks and chains. Hands that once created now only obeyed. Sons were born amid groans, mothers wept without comfort, and still the people grew. Perhaps many thought God had forgotten, that the promise made to Abraham had faded, that Egypt was now the end of the line. But there was a sarcophagus, a silent, steadfast, unchanging reminder, a tomb that said, without words, "It's not over yet." Joseph's bones waited, as if they were the anchor of an unforgotten promise. They were there to remind that God is not man to lie, that even when all seems lost, he is still at work. And then came Moses, not with a sword, not with an army, but with a staff and a word, "Let my people go." The clash between the Lord and Pharaoh wasn't just political but spiritual, a confrontation between the will of man and the sovereignty of God, between the gods of Egypt and the God of Israel. And at the heart of that clash, amid plagues and resistance, an entire nation began to move. And in the midst of that movement, Joseph's bones were taken. The Bible says Moses took the bones with him. They weren't forgotten. They weren't left behind. Because that request, that seemingly small detail, was in truth the link between the ancient story and the new journey. It was the bridge between the faith of the patriarchs and the hope of the new generation. It was as if Joseph was saying, "You're not just leaving Egypt, you're fulfilling something that began long before." And there's something deeply moving in that. Imagine the people marching, leaving a land that crushed them, walking toward the unknown, carrying children, food, tents, and a coffin. A coffin with the remains of someone who had dreamed before them all. Joseph didn't see the sea part. He didn't walk the desert, but his faith crossed all those paths. His bones, kept in silence for generations, became witnesses to the fulfillment of the promise. And more than that, a sign that God is faithful even in the story's fine print. When they finally reached the promised land, Joseph's bones were buried in Shechem, a place of profound symbolic value, land of his ancestors, territory of inheritance. That wasn't just a burial, it was a milestone, an end and a beginning, a closing of a cycle. The dreaming boy, the slave, the governor, the prophet, now rested in peace, because everything he had believed in came to pass. And perhaps that's why this story resonates so deeply with us. All of us, in some measure, have our own bones of Joseph. Promises made in times of faith, now seemingly asleep in sarcophagi of silence. Things God told us, stored deep in our souls, that time, pain, and waiting have tried to bury. But Joseph's bones remind us, what God promises, he fulfills. Even if it takes generations, even if it crosses deserts, even if death tries to silence it. Joseph's story is the story of a man who never forgot who he was, even when everyone around him tried to convince him otherwise. He lived in palaces, but his heart was intense. He was treated as a king, but he knew he was heir to something greater. He didn't want a tomb among Egypt's gods. He wanted to rest where the God of his fathers had promised. And so, with feet on foreign soil and eyes on eternity, Joseph ended his life with a simple and eternal gesture.